The air in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory carried 2 scents on the morning of November 5th, 1887. Pine resin sharp and clean from the forests that climbed the slopes like dark water frozen mid-surge, and snow, not the snow itself which had not yet fallen, but the iron promise of it, the way the sky tasted when winter was gathering its strength in the high places preparing to descend. Elspeth Morgan stood 12 yards from the cabin. Her husband had built with timber he had felled, himself watching a man named Augustus Blackwell tack a legal notice to the door. The paper was crisp, official, stamped with the seal of the Northern Pacific Railroad Company. The sound of the hammer striking the nail was obscene in the morning stillness. 3 strikes. Final. Blackwell did not look at her as he worked. He was a professional in the business of dispossession, and eye contact was a luxury he could not afford. The cabin was small, honest in its construction. Owen had built it in the Welsh way with attention to the grain of the wood, to the way water would flow off the roof to the morning sun. He had built it to last. But lasting, Elspeth had learned, was not the same as keeping. Ownership was a legal fiction that could be rewritten by men with authority and paper. She wore a dark wool dress, mended twice at the elbows, and a shawl that had belonged to her mother in Merthyr Tydfil, in the coal valleys of Wales. Her hair, the color of wet iron, was pulled back severely. She was 32 years old. She looked older. Grief and labor will do that. At her feet sat a single wooden crate, perhaps 2 feet square. Everything she owned in this territory, in this country, in this world, fit inside it with room to spare. A cast iron skillet, its bottom blackened from 1,000 fires. A wool blanket Hudson Bay, the kind that could keep a man alive at 40 below if he knew how to use it. A tin-type photograph in a cracked frame showing a young woman and a young man on their wedding day, both of them solemn in the way people were solemn before cameras, as if they understood they were being turned into ghosts. And a leather journal, its cover softened by the calloused hands of a man who had spent his life underground. Blackwell finished his work and turned still, not meeting her gaze. He was 50 years old, clean-shaven, wearing a suit that was too fine for the frontier, but appropriate for his station. He represented capital. Capital did not get its hands dirty. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, his voice carrying the flat neutrality of a clerk reading a ledger. "The property reverts to Northern Pacific Railroad as of this date, under Territorial Eminent Domain Statute. Compensation of $170 has been deposited with the Redemption Bank and Trust in your name. You have 30 days to collect it." $170. Owen had paid $400 for the land. Had spent 3 years building the cabin in the hours between his shifts in the Homestead mine. But legal arithmetic did not account for sweat or dreams or the value of a man's last strength spent making a home for his wife. The railroad requires this corridor for the expansion of the Dakota Central Spur. Blackwell continued, gesturing vaguely eastward with one gloved hand. "Depot construction begins in the spring. You'll need to make arrangements for relocation. The church auxiliary in Redemption has been notified of your situation. They are prepared to offer temporary assistance." Temporary assistance. The words were carefully chosen. Charity parsed into language that did not sting quite so badly. Elspeth said nothing. There was nothing to say. The law was the law, and the law had decided that the future belonged to railroads, not to Welsh widows with no money, and no family and no claim on anyone's pity, except the threadbare kind that came with conditions. Blackwell mounted his horse, a well-fed bay that had never known a hard winter. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that might have been respect, or might have been habit. Then he rode down the track toward redemption, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust that hung in the still air like accusations. Elspeth stood motionless for a long moment, listening to the silence that rushed in to fill the space his departure had created. Somewhere in the trees, a Clark's nutcracker called harsh and mocking. The sky was the color of old pewter. The temperature was dropping. By nightfall, it would be below freezing. By week's end, the first real snow would come, and after that, the long siege of winter. She bent and picked up the crate. It was not heavy. That was perhaps the saddest thing about it. A life reduced to kindling weight. She did not look back at the cabin. Looking back was an invitation to a grief she could not afford. Not now, not with winter coming and no roof and no plan and no margin for the luxury of despair. Instead, she turned and began to walk. Not toward the town of redemption, which lay a mile down the dusty track, but away from it up into the rolling pine-choked hills that rose like the hunched backs of sleeping animals against the vast, indifferent sky. Owen had loved these hills. He had said they reminded him of home, but grander, wilder, without the coal dust and the coughing and the gray exhaustion that hung over the Welsh valleys like a curse that would not lift. He had spent his few free days walking these ridges, reading the land the way a miner learns to read stone. He had taught her to see what he saw, the way water shaped rock over centuries, the way trees spoke of what lay beneath their roots, the way the earth itself was a kind of text if you learned the language. She walked for hours. The sun, pale and distant, arced across the southern sky and began its descent toward the jagged western peaks. The air grew colder, acquired edges. Her breath became visible. The crate handle bit into her palms, but she did not stop. Pain was information. Information could be used. She was following a memory. A ghost of a conversation from 2 years prior, when Owen had still been well enough to walk without stopping every 20 yards to cough up pieces of his lungs. He had brought her to a place he had found while prospecting following a seam of quartz, a miner's habit he had never lost. An old homestead claim from the 1860s abandoned when the original settler had been beaten back by winters that did not care about determination or courage or the American promise of land for those brave enough to take it. All that remained, Owen had told her, was the collapsed frame of a barn and a root cellar dug into the side of a hill. A spring cellar cut into the earth for keeping milk and butter and vegetables from freezing or rotting. A hole in the ground. Most people would see it as a tomb, a place of damp and darkness and slow decay. But Owen, who had spent half his life in the deep mines of Wales, had seen it differently. Down below, Elspeth, he had said, his voice already roughened by the silicosis that was killing him one breath at a time. The seasons forget themselves. The rock holds the memory of summer deep into winter, and the cool of winter long into summer. The earth has a long, slow breath. Most men never learn to hear it. She found the place just as dusk was settling that strange blue hour, when the world loses its edges and everything becomes uncertain. The cellar entrance was a dark scar in the hillside, almost completely hidden by overgrown hawthorn and wild raspberry canes that had gone dormant for the winter. The entrance was a low, crumbling arch of fieldstone perhaps 4 feet high at its peak. The kind of thing a man would have to duck to enter. The kind of thing that said, "This is not a place for living. This is a place for storing." Elspeth set down the crate and pulled away the worst of the brambles, her hands bleeding from the thorns. The wooden door that had once closed the entrance had rotted away years ago. Beyond it, darkness. She pulled a candle stub and matches from her pocket, struck a light, and stepped inside. The cellar was small, perhaps 12 feet by 15, with walls of packed earth and exposed stone and a ceiling of hand-hewn timbers that sagged in the middle, but had not yet collapsed. The floor was hard-packed dirt, smooth from feet that had walked it 40 years ago. It smelled of damp soil, of decay, of absence. The temperature inside was noticeably warmer than outside. Not warm, but warmer. The earth's breath, just as Owen had said. She set the candle on a flat stone and stood in the flickering light, looking at what would be her home. There was no furniture, no fireplace, no window, no chimney. There was nothing except dirt and stone and timber and the profound stillness that comes from being underground. It was a hole, a grave, but it was out of the wind. That first night was the worst night of her life, and she had known many bad nights. She wrapped herself in the Hudson Bay blanket and sat in the corner farthest from the entrance, the candle burning down to nothing, the darkness pressing in like something alive. The cold was a physical presence, seeping up through the ground and into her bones. It was different from the aggressive, biting cold of the open air. This was passive cold, the absence of heat, the slow, patient cold of stone. Outside, she could hear the wind beginning to pick up, moaning through the pines like something in pain. Inside the cellar, the air was still stale heavy with the smell of earth. She was alone. More alone than she had ever been even in the months after Owen died, when the house was full of his absence. This was a different kind of alone. This was the alone of the last person on earth. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury, a release of energy she might need later. Instead, she pulled Owen's journal from the crate and opened it, her cold, stiffened fingers clumsy with the pages. The candlelight was almost gone, but she could still make out his handwriting, that compact, powerful script that looked like it had been carved rather than written. The journal was a technical document full of notes on rock strata and ventilation shafts and the persistent, deadly problem of methane gas, the fire damp that killed miners in their dozens when it found a spark. But scattered throughout were observations, fragments of a philosophy that Owen had never spoken aloud, but had committed to paper, as if he knew that someday someone would need them. On a page dated April of 1884, 3 years before his death, she found an entry that stopped her cold. The Americans dig like they are at war, violent, extractive. They attack the earth as if it is an enemy to be defeated. The Welsh dig like they are at prayer, careful, respectful, listening. We know the earth is older than we are, and it will be here when we are dust. The trick is not to conquer it, but to learn its language, to ask permission, to work with its nature, not against it. Below this, in the margin, written in a different ink as if added later, was a single line in Welsh. American wer yin tilu fel rifle. Cymru yin tilu fel gwedi. Americans dig like war. Welsh dig like prayer. And below that, underlined twice in English, if I die before I can build Watia Nadlu, Elspeth must. She understands stone better than any foreman I have known. Watia Nadlu, the breathing house. Elspeth turned the page, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. What followed was a series of sketches and notes, technical drawings of a system she had never seen before. A horizontal flue running 30 feet underground before venting to the surface. A fresh air intake pipe buried parallel drawing cold air from outside, but pre-warming it through contact with earth that had been heated by the waste heat from the flue. A small stove not for heating the air directly, but for charging a massive thermal battery, the earth itself. It was elegant. It was radical. It was completely counter to every principle of American fireplace design, which depended on the violent upward draft of a tall chimney to suck smoke out of a house. This system forced the smoke to travel horizontally, to surrender its heat to stone, to pay rent, as the old Welsh miners said, before being allowed to escape. The notes were dense with calculations, with Welsh mining terminology, with references to systems Owen had seen in the deep mines of Merthyr, where the constant 55-degree temperature of the earth, hundreds of feet down, created natural ventilation without any mechanical assistance. He had been working on this design for years. He had intended to build it, but the mine company, American to its core, had called it foreign superstition and refused to fund it. The last entry on the page was dated 6 months before Owen died. The company men laugh at the old ways. They burn coal like it is infinite. They heat their houses like they are fighting the sky. And every winter people freeze in homes that should keep them warm, because they have forgotten that the earth is not the enemy. It is the ally. It remembers. If I do not live to prove this, perhaps Elspeth will. She is stronger than I ever was. The candle went out. Darkness swallowed the cellar. Elspeth sat in the black silence, the journal open on her lap, Owen's words echoing in her mind. She understood suddenly what he had been trying to tell her. This was not just a technical system. This was a legacy, a gift, a way of surviving that did not depend on fighting the earth, but on listening to it, on working with its nature, on remembering that the stone beneath her feet held the memory of summer, even in the depths of winter, if she could learn to draw it out. She was not going to freeze in this hole. She was going to transform it. She was going to make the earth breathe. Morning came slowly, gray light seeping into the cellar like water filling a well. Elspeth woke stiff and frozen her body, one large ache but alive. The world outside was painted white. The first snow had fallen during the night, a thin blanket covering everything, turning the familiar landscape into something strange and inhospitable. The problem was immediate and overwhelming. Shelter was one thing, warmth was another. A fire inside the cellar would fill it with smoke and suffocate her in minutes. A fire outside was a futile gesture against a Dakota winter, a small puddle of heat in an ocean of cold. She would burn through any wood she could gather in days, and then she would freeze. But Owen had given her the answer. Atai Anadlu, the breathing house, a system that did not fight the earth but used it. A system that stored heat instead of throwing it away. A system that made the smoke pay rent. She stood at the mouth of the cellar, looking out at the white world, and made her decision. She would build it, not because she believed it would work, though Owen's notes were convincing, not because she had any other choice, though. That was true. She would build it because Owen had asked her to, in the only way the dead can ask the living for anything. Through words left behind. Through trust placed in a journal that he knew she would read. She walked the mile into redemption, not to beg but to trade. The town was small, a collection of wood-frame buildings clinging to existence in a valley that had been carved out of the wilderness by men who believed that civilization was something you could impose on a landscape by force of will. It had a general store, a church, a bank, a blacksmith, a saloon, and about 200 permanent residents who had learned to endure winters that would have broken people from gentler climates. Llewellyn's Hardware and General Supply stood on the main street, a 2-story building with a false front that made it look grander than it was. Elspeth pushed open the door, a bell jangling overhead, and stepped into warmth and the smell of lamp oil and sawdust and coffee. The man behind the counter was old, perhaps 70, with a face carved by years into something resembling the landscape he lived in. Deep lines, hard angles, eyes that had seen things and remembered them. He looked up as she entered, and his expression shifted from the neutral face of a merchant to something else, recognition. Not of her, but of something in her. "You are Welsh," he said. Not a question, a statement. His accent, faint but unmistakable, confirmed it. "I am," Elspeth replied, "from Merthyr Tydfil, UK. Blenavon, 43 years ago." He wiped his hands on his apron, studying her. "Griffith Llewellyn. And you are Elspeth Morgan Owen Rhys Morgan's widow. I knew your husband. He came in here sometimes, bought powder and fuse. Good man. I was sorry to hear of his passing." "Thank you, Mr. Llewellyn." "Griff, we are too few in this territory to stand on formality." He looked past her out the window toward the street. "I heard about the railroad taking your land. Blackwell was in here yesterday talking like it was just business. I suppose to him it is." Elspeth set her small bundle on the counter. Inside was Owen's pocket watch, silver engraved with his initials. It was the last thing of value she owned. "I need tools," she said. "A small pot-belly stove, 20 feet of stovepipe, a shovel, and a pickaxe. I am prepared to trade." Griff looked at the watch, then at her. His face was unreadable. "What are you building, Mrs. Morgan?" She hesitated, then decided that honesty was simpler than deception. "A thermal system. Horizontal flue earth battery. My husband designed it. I am going to build it." Griff's eyebrows rose. He picked up the watch, turned it over in his hands, then set it down. "Owen showed me drawings once. He called it Y.T. Anadlu, the breathing house. I told him it was brilliant. I also told him the Americans would never understand it. They think the only way to heat a house is to burn the house next door." He paused. "You are going to build this in that old root cellar up in the hills." "I am. You will be mocked. They will call you mad. Let them." Griff smiled a slow, sad smile that spoke of old battles and old defeats, and the stubborn refusal to stop fighting. "Peda grando arisais," he said quietly. "Maer der yin kofio." Don't listen to the Englishman. The earth remembers. He moved through the store gathering items. A small cast iron stove, sturdy and efficient. Stovepipe in sections. A good shovel, not new, but well maintained. A pickaxe with a hickory handle. He set them on the counter, then added a box of matches, a coil of rope, and a small axe. "The watch is worth about $30, he said. "These supplies run about $45. I will take the watch and you will owe me the difference. No interest. Pay when you can if you can. If you cannot, then consider it a gift from one Simro to another." Elspeth felt something tighten in her chest. Kindness when you were not expecting it was a dangerous thing. It could break you more surely than cruelty. "I will pay you back, Mr. Llewellyn." "Griff, and I know you will. You have Owen's spine. You will need it." The bell over the door jangled. A man entered, large, perhaps 45, wearing work clothes that were clean but worn, and carrying the unmistakable air of someone who was accustomed to authority. He had the hands of a man who worked with wood scarred and calloused, and the eyes of someone who had learned to see the world in terms of joinery and stress and load-bearing capacity. He nodded to Griff, then noticed Elspeth and stopped. "Mrs. Morgan," he said. His voice was deep measured. "I heard about the railroad. I am sorry for your trouble. If you need work, my crew could use someone who can keep accounts. The pay is not much, but it is steady." It was Elspeth realized a genuine offer, an attempt at kindness from a man who did not know her but had been raised to believe that you help people when you could. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Silas Thorne. I build most of the houses in this valley." "Thank you, Mr. Thorne, but I have other plans." Silas glanced at the supplies on the counter, the stove, the pipe, the tools. His expression shifted concern mixing with something else. Doubt. "Those are building supplies," he said. "You are not planning to winter in that old cellar." It was not a question. It was a statement of disbelief. "I am." "Mrs. Morgan, with respect, that is not possible. A cellar is for storage, not habitation. There is no proper ventilation, no insulation, no fireplace. You put a stove in that hole, the smoke will back up and kill you in your sleep. It is a death trap." Elspeth met his gaze, her expression calm. The earth is a slow radiator, Mr. Thorne. It holds heat. The smoke will travel the length of a horizontal flue, and the stones will take its warmth. By the time the smoke reaches the vent at the end, it will be cold. All the heat will have been collected and stored in the earth itself. The cellar will not be heated by the stove. It will be heated by the earth. Silas stared at her as if she had begun speaking in tongues. That is not how heat works, he said, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining simple facts to a child. Heat rises, smoke rises. You are proposing to force smoke sideways through 30 feet of cold stone. It will not draw. The system will fail. You will suffocate. The earth breathes, Mr. Thorne, Elspeth said quietly. I am simply giving it a mouth. Silas looked from her to Griff, who was watching the exchange with the faint smile of someone who had seen this argument before in other forms, in other places. Griff, tell her this is madness. Griff shrugged. Her husband was the best mining engineer I ever met. If Owen Reese Morgan designed a system, I would trust it over any American fireplace I have seen. Your houses are beautiful, Silas, but they burn wood like it is free, and they leak heat like sieves. The Welsh have been heating underground spaces for 1,000 years. Maybe it is time we listened. Silas's jaw tightened. He was a man who took pride in his work, and criticism, even gentle criticism, was not easy to hear. Mrs. Morgan, he said, turning back to her. I lost my younger sister to winter 10 years ago. She was 19. Her husband had left her, and she was too proud to ask for help. She tried to survive alone in a cabin 20 miles from here. We found her in February, frozen 10 feet from her door. She had run out of wood. I will not stand by and watch another woman die from stubbornness. There was pain in his voice, old and deep. Elspeth felt it, recognized it as the same species of grief she carried for Owen. I am sorry for your loss, Mr. Thorne, she said. But I am not being stubborn. I am being careful. My husband spent years designing this system. I will build it correctly, or I will not build it at all. But I will not accept charity, and I will not abandon what he started. Then you will freeze. Perhaps, but it will be my choice. Silas shook his head, a gesture of frustration and resignation. He looked like he wanted to say more, but he had learned, perhaps, that some arguments cannot be won with logic. When it fails, he said quietly, and it will fail, my family has a spare room. The offer stands. No shame in accepting help when you need it. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. I will remember that. He left without another word, the door swinging shut behind him. Griff watched him go, then turned back to Elspeth. He is not a bad man, Griff said. He is frightened for you. Fear makes people rigid. I know. Griff helped her load the supplies into a small handcart he loaned her, and she began the long walk back up into the hills, pulling the cart behind her, the metal wheels squeaking in the cold. She spent the next 2 weeks working from dawn until dark, her hands bleeding her back, screaming, her body pushed past limits she did not know she had. She dug the trench for the flue 30 feet long, angling slightly upward to create draft. She lined it with stones she hauled from the creek bed, flat field stones that fit together like puzzle pieces, creating a channel for the smoke to travel. She mixed clay and mud to seal the gaps, packing it tight, smoothing it with her hands until her fingers were raw. Griff came up twice ostensibly to check on the supplies, but really to offer quiet advice. He had worked in mines that used similar principles for ventilation, and his knowledge filled the gaps in Owen's notes. Together they solved problems that would have stopped her cold. How to create enough draft with a horizontal run. How to insulate the fresh air intake to prevent condensation. How to build the final vertical stack to create the pressure differential that would pull smoke through the system. The town watched. At first with curiosity, then with a growing sense of concern that bordered on morbid fascination. She was seen hauling stones, digging building. It made no sense. The general consensus delivered in the saloon and the general store and the church after services was that the Welsh widow had lost her mind with grief. Some called it Pritchard's folly, confusing her with a family that had failed in a similar way years before. Others more cruelly dubbed it the Welsh coffin. Silas Thorne came by 3 more times, each visit shorter and more tense than the last. He watched her work his face, a mask of professional assessment and personal worry. He pointed out structural issues that did not exist and offered advice she did not need. He was trying in his way to save her life, but she did not need saving. She needed to be left alone to work. On the 3rd visit, his wife came with him. Judith Thorne was a woman of perhaps 38, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who had been a schoolteacher before marriage and had not entirely given up the habit of education. She watched Elspeth fit stones into the flue, watched the careful precision of the work, and something in her expression changed. "May I ask what you are building, Mrs. Morgan?" she asked. Elspeth straightened, wiping mud from her hands. "A heat exchanger," she said. "The smoke from the stove will travel through this underground flue. As it moves through the stone, it will transfer its heat to the rock and earth. The earth will store that heat and radiate it back into the cellar. It is called thermal mass. The principle is the same as why the deep earth stays the same temperature year-round." Judith tilted her head, considering. "That is elegant," she said. "May I see the design?" Elspeth hesitated, then retrieved Owen's journal from the cellar. Judith read the notes, her finger tracing the diagrams, her lips moving slightly as she worked through the calculations. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. "Your husband was trained as an engineer. He was trained as a miner, but he understood physics better than any engineer I have met. This should work," Judith said. "The math is sound. The principle is sound. I do not understand why Silas thinks it will fail." "Because it is not the way things are done here," Elspeth said. "And because he is afraid." Judith handed back the journal, then looked at her husband, who was standing a few yards away, arms crossed, face set. "Silas," she said, her voice carrying a note of gentle challenge. "This is not madness, this is science. Science that has never been tested in these conditions. Silas replied, all science is untested until someone tests it. Silas said nothing, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. He was a man who built with his hands, who understood loads and stresses and the breaking point of materials. But this was a different kind of building, one that worked with invisible forces and long-term storage of energy. It was outside his expertise, and that made him uncomfortable. They left without further argument, but Elspeth saw Judith look back twice, her expression thoughtful. By the 20th of November, the system was nearly complete. The horizontal flue was finished, sealed, tested with smoke to ensure there were no leaks. The fresh air intake pipe was buried parallel, its mouth rising 3 feet above the expected snow line. The small potbelly stove was installed in the corner of the cellar, its pipe connecting to the entrance of the underground flue. The final vertical stack, 10 feet tall, stood at the terminus of the system, its top capped with a simple rain shield. It looked insane. A stove connected to a pipe that disappeared into the floor ran sideways through the earth for 30 feet, then emerged as a thin chimney in the middle of nowhere. No one looking at it would believe it could work. Elspeth stood in the cellar, looking at what she had built, and felt the first real whisper of doubt. What if Silas was right? What if the system failed, not because the physics were wrong, but because she had made some error in construction, some flaw that would become apparent only when it was too late? What if she died here alone, suffocated by her own ambition? She shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. Doubt was a luxury. She had committed to this path. There was no going back. On the evening of November 22nd, the town of Redemption held a meeting in the church. It was ostensibly about preparations for winter, about sharing resources and coordinating care for the elderly and infirm. But the real topic, the one everyone wanted to discuss, was the Welsh widow in the hills. And what, if anything, should be done about her? Tobias Merrick, the town mayor, was a man of 55, with the diplomatic skills of someone who had spent a lifetime mediating disputes between stubborn people in a hard land. He called the meeting to order and quickly got to the point. Mrs. Morgan has made it clear she intends to winter in that old cellar, he said. I have spoken with her. She is of sound mind and she is aware of the risks. The question before us is whether we have a responsibility to intervene. Silas stood. I have tried to reason with her. She is building a system that defies every principle of heating I know. When it fails, and it will fail, she will die. We cannot simply allow that to happen. What do you propose? Merrick asked. Forcibly remove her on what legal grounds? On the grounds of basic human decency. Griff Llewellyn stood, his old bones creaking. Silas, you are a fine builder, the best in this valley, but you do not know everything. Mrs. Morgan's husband was a master mining engineer trained in Wales, where they have been working underground for longer than this country has existed. The system she is building is based on principles that are well established in deep mines. Just because you have not seen it does not mean it cannot work. I have seen plenty of things that look good on paper and failed in practice, Silas shot back. Judith Thorne stood, which surprised everyone because she rarely spoke in public meetings. "I have seen the design," she said. "I have reviewed the calculations. The physics is sound. Whether it will work in practice is unknown, but it is not irrational. Mrs. Morgan is taking a calculated risk, not throwing her life away. And if the calculation is wrong," Silas asked, his voice rising, "then she will have died trying something new, which is more than most of us can say." The room fell silent. It was a harsh truth, but truth nonetheless. Mayor Merrick raised a hand. "I propose a compromise," he said. "A wager, if you will. Let us make this a test. Mrs. Morgan is confident her system will work. Silas is confident it will not. Let us settle it with evidence." "What kind of test?" Silas asked. "A simple one. Both of you will maintain and record the interior temperature of your respective structures every week from now until the end of winter. Mrs. Morgan in her cellar. Silas in your best cabin. Judith will act as the neutral recorder. We will compare the results. If Mrs. Morgan's system maintains a higher average temperature while using less fuel, then her method is proven superior. If it fails, she will accept help and relocate. And if I win," Silas asked, "then you will have the satisfaction of being right and the responsibility of teaching the rest of us why her method failed." Silas looked like he wanted to object, but the logic was sound. It was a way to let the widow try her experiment without simply abandoning her to fate. "And the stakes?" Griff asked. Merrick smiled. "If Mrs. Morgan wins, the railroad will be petitioned to pay her 5 times the standard compensation for her land and to issue a public apology for dismissing foreign engineering methods. If Silas wins, Mrs. Morgan agrees to write a full account of why the system failed, so others can learn from her mistakes." There was a murmur of approval. It was a frontier solution to a frontier problem. Let the experiment run. Let the evidence decide. "Does anyone object?" Merrick asked. No one did. "Then it is settled. The wager begins December 1st. May the best design win." The meeting adjourned. Silas left quickly, his face unreadable. Judith lingered, speaking quietly with Griff. As people filed out into the cold November night, the talk was of nothing but the wager. The odds were quickly established in the saloon. 8-1 in favor of Silas Thorne and his proven American methods. Only a handful of romantics and a few old Welsh miners bet on the widow. Elspeth was not at the meeting. She was in her cellar alone, finishing the last details of the installation. She would not learn about the wager until Judith Thorne came to visit the next morning, bringing a thermometer and a notebook, and the news that her winter had become a public spectacle. But that night, alone in the darkness with the first real cold of winter settling over the hills, Elspeth lit a small fire in her stove. She closed the door, adjusted the damper, and watched as smoke began to travel down the pipe into the earth sideways, through 30 feet of stone, and finally out the distant chimney. The draft was weak, but it was there. The smoke moved. The system breathed. She placed her hand on the earthen wall beside her. It was cool to the touch, but not freezing. Not yet. It would take days, perhaps weeks, for the thermal battery to charge, for the earth to remember the heat she was feeding it. But it would remember. Stone always remembered. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the pines like something wild and hungry. Inside the cellar, the air was still. Elspeth sat on her bedroll, Owen's journal open on her lap, and read by the faint glow of the stove's vent holes. Nid yw'r manid yin yim ladi geaf. Main dal cuff your half yin dufen yinai garag ek main arrows. The mountain does not fight the winter. It holds the memory of summer deep in its stone, and it waits. She closed the journal and blew out the candle. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, the town would watch. Tomorrow, the wager would start. But tonight, for the first time since Owen died, Elspeth Morgan felt something that resembled hope. The earth was beginning to breathe. December arrived like an invading army. The first serious cold front swept down from Canada on the night of the 30th of November, dropping temperatures by 40 degrees in 6 hours. By morning, the world had hardened into something crystalline and hostile. Water left in buckets overnight had frozen solid. Breath hung in the air like smoke. The pines groaned under the weight of ice, forming on their branches a sound like distant artillery. In the town of Redemption, people woke to the reality that the easy part of autumn was over. Now came the test. Now came the long months when the land stopped pretending to be hospitable and revealed its true nature. Brutal, patient, indifferent to human ambition. Silas Thorne stood in front of the railroad depot cabin he had been contracted to build, watching his crew arrive in the gray pre-dawn light. It was the finest structure he had ever designed, 20 feet by 30, with walls of hand-selected lodgepole pine, double-chinked with oakum and clay. The corners were dovetailed with a precision that would have impressed a furniture maker. The floor was raised 6 inches off the ground on river stone footings to prevent frost heave. And at the center of it all, dominating the interior like an altar, stood a massive fieldstone fireplace, 8 feet wide, with a chimney that rose 14 feet to the roof peak. It was a monument to everything Silas knew about keeping people alive in winter. Thick walls to hold heat, tight joinery to stop drafts, a fireplace large enough to burn logs that would smolder all night, radiating heat like a captured sun. He had built it to be the warmest structure in the territory, a showcase for potential railroad investors who would pass through in the spring. But now it had acquired a second purpose. It was his entry in a contest he had not wanted but could not refuse. He thought about the widow in her hole in the ground, and he felt the familiar twist of anger and fear. She was going to die. The physics were simple, undeniable. Heat rose. Smoke rose. You could not force either one to travel sideways through cold stone without losing all energy. Her system would fail probably in the first serious cold snap. And then he would have another frozen woman on his conscience. Another ghost to join his sister Miriam in the gallery of people he had failed to save. He pushed the thought away and turned to his foreman. "Let us finish this," he said. "I want the fireplace operational by tonight." 3 miles away up in the hills, where the pines grew thick and the wind carried the smell of deep winter, Elspeth Morgan woke in darkness to the sound of her breath condensing in the air above her face. The temperature in the cellar had dropped overnight. She could feel it in her bones, in the stiffness of her joints, in the way her exhalation turned to frost on the wool blanket pulled up to her chin. She had been burning small fires in the potbelly stove for 5 days now, carefully watching the smoke travel through her system, adjusting dampers, learning the rhythm of the draft. The earth was slow to respond. The first few days, the walls had remained cold, indifferent, as if the heat she was feeding into the stone was simply vanishing into an infinite sink. But on the 4th day, she had noticed a change. A slight warmth, barely perceptible, radiating from the section of wall closest to the underground flue. The thermal battery was beginning to charge. She rose, her body protesting, and fed a few small logs into the stove. The fire caught quickly, the dry pine snapping and popping. She adjusted the damper to slow the burn, conserving fuel. The smoke curled down into the pipe, disappeared into the floor, began its journey through the stone labyrinth she had built. Outside, the thermometer that Judith Thorne had installed read 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cellar, Elspeth's thermometer, hanging from a timber near the center of the space, read 56 degrees. 56. Not warm, but survivable. And she was using perhaps 4 logs a day, small ones, where a conventional fireplace would devour 20 or more. The earth was beginning to remember. She dressed quickly, her fingers clumsy with cold, and stepped outside to mark the reading in Judith's log. The world was white and hard and beautiful in its cruelty. She could see her breath, could feel the cold, trying to find a way through her layers of wool and leather. But it was a different kind of cold than the cutting, aggressive cold of her first night in the cellar. This was expected cold, manageable cold, the kind you could plan for and endure. She heard footsteps crunching through the frozen snow and turned to see Judith Thorne approaching, wrapped in a heavy coat, carrying her record book and a leather satchel. "Good morning, Mrs. Morgan," Judith said, her voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around her face. "First official reading day. How are you faring?" "Well enough," Elspeth replied, gesturing to the thermometer. 56 inside, 18 outside. Judith noted the numbers, her pencil scratching across the page with the efficiency of someone who had spent years teaching children to do the same. "And Mr. Thorne's cabin, I took his reading at dawn. 68 degrees. He has a fire that would roast an ox." Judith's tone was neutral, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or skepticism about the efficiency of burning half a forest to achieve comfort. "Wood consumption?" Elspeth asked. "He estimates 40 logs per day to maintain that temperature. You, 4 logs, sometimes 6 if the wind is particularly fierce." Judith wrote the numbers down, then looked up at the distant chimney stack that marked the terminus of Elspeth's underground flue. A thin wisp of smoke rose from it, barely visible, dissipating quickly into the cold air. "It is working," Judith said quietly. "I did not doubt the physics, but seeing it in practice is something else entirely." "The earth is slow to warm," Elspeth said, "but once it warms, it is slow to cool. That is the advantage. Thermal inertia. My husband called it the Earth's long memory. Judith closed her book and looked at Elspeth with the frank assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime evaluating potential. May I ask you something? Of course. Why are you doing this? I understand you need shelter, but you could have accepted help. Silas is not a cruel man. He would have taken you in no questions asked. Instead, you chose this. Why? Elspeth was quiet for a moment, watching the smoke rise from her distant chimney. Because Owen asked me to, she said, finally. Not in words. He died before he could speak what was in his heart. But he left me his journal, and in it he left me this. A way of surviving that does not depend on fighting the earth, but on understanding it. If I had accepted charity, I would have been warm and fed and safe. But I would also have buried the last thing Owen gave me. His idea. His legacy. I could not do that. Judith nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied something in her. I think you are braver than I am, Mrs. Morgan. I think I am more stubborn. Often the same thing. They stood together in the cold for a moment. Two women in a landscape that had not been designed for easy living. Then Judith turned to go. I will be back next week for the second reading. If you need anything before then, you know where to find us. Thank you, Mrs. Thorne. And please thank your husband for me. I know this wager troubles him. It does. But trouble is sometimes the price of learning. Judith walked away, her footsteps fading into the crunch of snow and the whisper of wind through the pines. Elspeth watched her go, then returned to the cellar, to the slowly warming earth, to the work of survival. The days fell into a rhythm. Wake. Feed the fire. Record the temperature. Walk the perimeter to check for snow accumulation on the chimney stack. Gather wood. Melt snow for water. Eat sparingly from her supplies of dried beans and salt pork. Read Owen's journal by the dim glow of the stove. Sleep. Repeat. The town, meanwhile, watched. Not openly, but in the way small communities watch anything unusual. The talk in the general store was of the widow and her strange system. The odds in the saloon shifted slightly as the first week's numbers were posted. 56 degrees in a hole in the ground, with barely any fire, defied expectations. But Silas's cabin was still warmer, still more comfortable, still more in line with what everyone understood about how to survive winter. Griff Llewellyn visited twice in the second week of December, bringing supplies he claimed were surplus from the store, but which Elspeth suspected he had purchased specifically for her. Coffee, candles, a small sack of oats. She tried to refuse, but he waved away her objections. You are doing something important, he said. Important things require support. He inspected her system, checked the flue for cracks, tested the draft with smoke from his pipe. Everything was functioning as designed. The stones in the underground flue were warm to the touch, not hot, but radiating a steady, gentle heat that was slowly migrating into the surrounding earth. How long before the thermal battery is fully charged? He asked. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. The earth is patient. It does not respond to urgency. No, it responds to persistence, which you have in abundance. On the 15th of December, Clara Thorne appeared at the cellar entrance unannounced, carrying a small basket covered with a cloth. She was 8 years old, with her mother's intelligent eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. She stood in the snow looking uncertain, as if she had walked all this way on impulse and now regretted it. "Mrs. Morgan," she called. Elspeth emerged from the cellar, surprised. "Miss Thorne, does your father know you are here?" "No, ma'am, but Mama knows. She said I could come if I stayed on the trail and was back before dark." "And what brings you all this way in the cold?" Clara held out the basket. Inside were biscuits, still warm, wrapped in a towel. "Mama made extra. She thought you might like them." The girl paused, then added in a rush, "And I wanted to see how your system works. Papa says it is impossible, but Mama says the numbers do not lie. And I want to understand who is right." Elspeth smiled, the first genuine smile she had felt in weeks. "That is a very scientific attitude, Miss Thorne. Come inside. I will show you." They spent an hour in the cellar, Elspeth explaining the principles of thermal mass and heat exchange, using the stones and the earth and the smoke itself as teaching tools. Clara listened with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was a kind of power, and that power was not gendered. She asked questions that were far beyond her years. How did the draft work if heat wanted to rise? How much heat could stone hold? Why did the earth stay warm in winter? Elspeth answered each question carefully, not talking down to the child, but engaging with her as if she were a peer. It reminded her of conversations she had had with Owen back when he was teaching her to read the land, to see the invisible forces that shape the world. When it was time for Clara to leave, she paused at the entrance. "Mrs. Morgan, I think Papa is wrong about your system. I think it works, but I think he is scared, not stupid. His sister died in the cold. He does not want anyone else to die. That is why he is so certain you will fail." Elspeth knelt down to meet the girl's eyes. "Your father is a good man, Clara. Fear makes people rigid, but it also makes them careful. There is honor in both. Will you win the wager?" "I do not know, but I will not fail from lack of trying." Clara nodded as if this were an acceptable answer and walked away into the white landscape, her small form soon swallowed by distance and trees. That night Elspeth sat in the cellar, eating one of Judith's biscuits, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with thermal mass. The third week of December brought the first test. A mild front moved in from the west, pushing temperatures up into the low 40s. The snow on the southern slopes began to melt, creating a false promise of spring that anyone who had lived through a Dakota winter knew better than to trust. But the warmth was real even if temporary, and it revealed something unexpected. Silas Thorne's showcase cabin, with its massive fireplace and its thick walls, and its expert construction, began to lose temperature. With no fire burning, the logs cooled quickly, bleeding heat into the outside air. By the end of the second day of mild weather, the interior temperature had dropped to 60 degrees. Then 58, settling at a point barely warmer than the ambient outside temperature. Elspeth's cellar, by contrast, held steady. The thermal battery, now charged with 2 weeks of accumulated heat, did not care that the outside temperature had changed. The earth held its memory. The thermometer inside the cellar read 64 degrees on the first day of the warm spell, 65 on the second, 64 again. On the third, stable, unchanging. The system was working exactly as Owen had predicted. When Judith came to record the readings, she stood for a long moment, looking at the numbers, then at Elspeth. "This is remarkable," she said. "Silas's cabin responds immediately to external conditions. Yours does not. You have built a buffer." "The Earth is a battery," Elspeth said. "Batteries charge slowly and discharge slowly. That is their value. Silas will need to see this. I suspect he already has." That evening, Silas Thorne came to the cellar, not with the bluster of earlier visits, but quietly, respectfully, as one craftsman visiting another. He stood at the entrance looking at the simple pot-belly stove, the pipe disappearing into the floor, the earthen walls that should have been freezing, but were not. "May I come in?" he asked. Of course. He stepped inside, ducking under the low entrance, and stood in the center of the space. Elspeth watched him take it in. The way his eyes traced the line of the stovepipe, the way his hand reached out to touch the wall, testing its temperature. The way his professional assessment fought with his personal assumptions. "It is warmer in here than in my cabin," he said finally. "Without a fire. The earth holds heat. I know you have said that. But knowing it and feeling it are different things." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Morgan. I assumed you were building out of desperation. I did not consider you might be building out of knowledge. You were trying to protect me, Mr. Thorne. There is no shame in that. There is shame in arrogance. I have spent 20 years building in this territory, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about keeping people warm. But I never considered that the earth itself could be the heater. I was too focused on the fire." He paused. "Would you be willing to teach me, not now, not during the wager, but after? If you survive the blizzard season, I want to learn this method." Elspeth felt something shift in the air between them. This was not the skeptical builder trying to save a foolish widow. This was a craftsman recognizing superior engineering and having the humility to ask for instruction. "I would be honored, Mr. Thorne, but not as a teacher to a student, as a partner. You understand structure and materials in ways I do not. Together we could build something better than either of us could alone." Silas extended his hand. Elspeth shook it. The alliance was formed. He left shortly after, walking back toward town through the gathering dusk, and Elspeth returned to her fire, to her slowly warming earth, to the growing certainty that Owen's vision had been correct. The fourth week of December brought the return of cold, hard, and fast. The mild spell broke overnight temperatures plummeting back into the teens, then single digits, then below zero. The town braced for what everyone knew was coming. This was just the prelude. The real cold, the killing cold, the cold that would define who had prepared well and who had not, was still ahead. On the morning of January 6, 1888, Elspeth woke to a sound she did not recognize. a deep, muffled groan like the earth itself was shifting. She was out of her bedroll in seconds, lighting a candle, looking around the cellar for the source. At first, she saw nothing wrong. The stove was cold, the fire having burned down to ash overnight. The walls looked stable. The timbers overhead had not shifted. But the sound came again, louder this time, and she realized with a spike of cold fear where it was coming from. Above. She grabbed her coat and went to the entrance. The door, which should have opened easily, resisted. She pushed harder and it gave way with a shower of snow and ice. The world outside was buried. During the night, a heavy, wet snow had fallen, and the weight of it accumulating on the slope above the cellar had caused a section of the hillside to shift, to slide, to collapse inward. The entrance was half buried. The hawthorn bushes that had marked the location were gone, snapped off or buried under tons of snow and frozen earth. And worse, far worse, the main ventilation shaft, the one that allowed fresh air into the cellar, while the smoke exited through the distant chimney, was completely blocked. Elspeth stood in the dim pre-dawn light, her breath coming fast, her mind racing through the implications. The system depended on airflow. Smoke out, fresh air in. If the fresh air could not enter the stove, would not draw. And if she lit a fire anyway, the carbon dioxide would build up slowly, invisibly, until she fell asleep and never woke. She had perhaps 6 hours before the oxygen in the sealed cellar dropped to dangerous levels. Maybe less if she panicked and breathed faster. She needed to dig out the vent, but the snow was packed hard, frozen solid in places, and she was one woman with a shovel. She went back inside, forced herself to be calm, to think. Owen had designed redundancy into the system. There was a secondary fresh air intake, smaller, buried alongside the smoke flue. She had installed it as a backup, never expecting to need it. She crawled to the far corner of the cellar, found the small pipe, and opened the damper that controlled it. A whisper of cold air flowed in. Not much, but some. Enough to keep the oxygen circulating. Enough to keep her alive if she did not light the stove. But that created a different problem. Without the stove, without heat, the cellar would begin to cool. The thermal battery was charged, but it was not infinite. It would bleed heat into the surrounding frozen earth, and eventually the temperature inside would drop to freezing. She could survive cold, but not forever, and not without risk of frostbite or worse. She sat in the darkness, weighing her options. Light the stove and risk suffocation. Do not light the stove and risk freezing. Dig out the main vent and hope she finished before exhaustion or cold stopped her. There was no good choice, only less bad ones. She decided to dig. For 3 hours she worked in the freezing dawn, attacking the snow with her shovel. Her breath coming in ragged clouds, her hands going numb inside her gloves. The snow was heavy, wet, difficult. Every shovelful she removed seemed to be replaced by more sliding down from above. It was like bailing water from a sinking boat. Necessary. Probably futile. By mid-morning she had made progress, but not enough. The vent was still buried under at least 4 feet of packed snow. Her muscles were screaming. Her vision was starting to blur at the edges, a sign of exhaustion or hypothermia or both. She stopped leaning on the shovel, trying to catch her breath. and realized that she might actually die here. Not from the cold, not from suffocation, but from simple, stupid overwork pushing her body past its limits in a desperate attempt to solve an unsolvable problem. She heard voices, distant, calling her name. She turned and saw figures emerging from the tree line. 3 of them, moving toward her through the snow. As they got closer, she recognized Silas Thorne in the lead, followed by Griff Llewellyn and a younger man she did not know. Silas took one look at the collapsed entrance, at Elspeth's exhausted face, at the shovel in her hands, and understood immediately. "The vent is blocked," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." "How long do you have?" "I opened the secondary intake. It is buying me time, but not much." Silas turned to the men with him. "We dig. Now. Fast as we can. Griff, you take the left side, Thomas right. I will work the center. Mrs. Morgan, you rest. You are no good to anyone if you collapse." They dug with the efficiency of men who knew what real work looked like, who understood that speed mattered, that every minute counted. The snow flew. Within an hour, they had exposed the top of the vent shaft. Within 2, it was completely clear and fresh air was flowing into the cellar again. Silas straightened, breathing hard, his face red from exertion. "You designed a backup system," he said. "Owen did. He believed in redundancy. It saved your life." "It did." Silas looked at her, and something in his expression had changed. This was no longer the skeptical builder trying to save a foolish woman. This was respect. Recognition of engineering that had anticipated failure and planned for it. "Your system," he said slowly, "is not just clever. It is wise. I build for strength. You built for resilience. There is a difference." "My husband built for resilience," Elspeth corrected. "I am just following his design." "No. You adapted when it failed. You made choices under pressure. That is not following. That is mastery." They stood in the cold. The crisis over the danger passed, and Elspeth felt the last of her strength drain away. Her legs buckled. Silas caught her before she fell, his carpenter's hands strong and steady. "Thomas, help me get her inside. Griff, make sure that vent stays clear. I am not digging it out again." They carried her into the cellar, wrapped her in blankets, lit a small fire in the stove. The smoke traveled down through the stone out the distant chimney. The system breathed. Air flowed. The danger was over. Judith arrived an hour later, alerted by her husband bringing hot soup and dry clothes. She sat with Elspeth while the men reinforced the hillside above the cellar, piling stones and timber to prevent another collapse. "You frightened us," Judith said quietly. "I frightened myself. Silas came home yesterday and told me he was wrong about your system. He said it was the best winter design he had ever seen. I have been married to that man for 15 years, and I have never heard him admit he was wrong about anything related to building." Elspeth managed a weak smile. "Fear makes people rigid. Evidence makes them flexible. You could have died. But I did not. The system worked. Even when it failed, it worked. That was Owen's genius. He planned for failure. Judith was quiet for a long moment, then said, "The wager is essentially over, you know. Silas knows it, I know it. The town will know it soon enough. Your system is superior, not just in fuel efficiency, but in resilience. When the real cold comes, when the blizzards hit, your cellar will hold steady, while every cabin in Redemption burns through its woodpile in a week. The wager runs until March, yes, but the outcome is no longer in doubt." That evening, after everyone had left, after she had eaten and warmed and recovered enough to think clearly, Elspeth sat in her cellar and opened Owen's journal to a page she had read a dozen times, but had not fully understood until now. The earth is not just a battery, and he had written. It is a partner. It will hold your heat, but it will also teach you patience. It will keep you alive, but it will also demand that you trust it when every instinct tells you to panic. Building with the earth is not just engineering. It is faith. She understood now what he meant. When the vent had collapsed, her instinct had been to dig, to fight, to solve the problem with muscle and will. But the real solution had been in the design itself. The secondary intake, the redundancy, the slow, patient accumulation of heat in stone that did not panic when the surface world shifted. She closed the journal and lay back on her bedroll, feeling the gentle warmth radiating from the walls around her. Outside, the temperature was dropping again, heading toward another night of brutal cold. Inside, the thermometer read 62 degrees. Stable, steady. The earth remembering summer, holding it close, giving it back in measured doses. She thought about Silas, about the way his certainty had crumbled when faced with evidence. About Judith with her scientist's mind and her careful records. About Clara hungry for knowledge. About Griff who had believed in the old ways when no one else would. She thought about partnerships, about how the best things were built, not in isolation, but in collaboration. How Owen had given her the design, but Griff had given her the practical knowledge, and Silas grudgingly was beginning to give her respect. The town was learning, slowly, but learning. And when the real test came, when the blizzards of January arrived with their killing cold and their suffocating snow, they would all see what the earth could do when you treated it as a partner instead of an enemy. Elspeth closed her eyes and let the warmth of the stone carry her toward sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow the temperatures would drop further. Tomorrow the town would gather to hear about the cave-in and the rescue, and the system that had survived its first real failure. But tonight she was warm. She was alive. And the earth beneath her was breathing slow and patient, and utterly reliable, just as Owen had promised it would be. The mountain did not fight winter. It held summer's memory deep in its stone, and it waited. The morning of January 10th, 1888, dawned deceptively calm. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that promised nothing and revealed even less. The temperature hovered around 20 degrees cold, but not brutally so, the kind of cold that Dakota residents had learned to live with, to work through, to endure without comment. In Redemption, smoke rose from chimneys in lazy vertical columns undisturbed by wind. Children walked to the small schoolhouse without their heaviest coats. It felt against all reason and experience like the worst of winter might be behind them. Elspeth stood at the entrance to her cellar, watching the light change as the sun climbed behind a thin veil of high clouds. Something in the air felt wrong. Not the temperature, which was manageable, not the wind, which was absent, but something else. A quality of stillness that was not peaceful, but expectant, like the pause between a question and an answer that no one wanted to hear. She had learned to trust these instincts. Owen had taught her to read weather, the way miners read stone, looking for the subtle signs that preceded disaster. A particular smell in the air, the behavior of birds, the way smoke rose or did not rise. And this morning the smoke from her distant chimney stack was behaving strangely. Instead of rising straight up, it was drifting, spreading out horizontally as if the air above it had become suddenly dense, resistant to penetration. She went back inside and checked her thermometer. 63 degrees. The earth battery fully charged now, radiating steady warmth. She had been burning minimal fires for the past 2 weeks, just enough to maintain the heat, conserving her wood supply. By her calculations, she had enough fuel to last through March, even if the temperatures stayed below zero for weeks. The system was working exactly as designed, but that wrongness in the air persisted. She was not the only one who felt it. In town, old men who had survived 40 Dakota winters were looking at the sky and shaking their heads. The barometric pressure had dropped overnight, fallen fast, and anyone with a decent weather glass knew what that meant. A storm was coming. Not a normal storm. Something worse. Tobias Merrick, the mayor, called an emergency town meeting for noon. The church filled quickly. Families crowding into pews, voices low and tense. Merrick stood at the front, his weathered face grave. "The glass is falling faster than I have seen in 10 years, he said without preamble. We have perhaps 24 hours before a major system hits. I am recommending that everyone ensure their wood supplies are accessible, their livestock are secured, and their families are prepared to shelter in place for at least 3 days. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. 3 days was a long time to be trapped indoors. But no one argued. They had all heard the stories of the blizzards that came without warning, that turned the world into a white void, where you could not see your hand in front of your face, where people froze to death 10 feet from their own doors because they could not find them. Silas Thorne stood. "The depot cabin can serve as emergency shelter if needed," he said. "It is the largest and warmest structure in town. Capacity is 40 people, maybe 50 if we crowd. If anyone finds themselves in trouble, if their home becomes unsafe, they should make for the depot. I will keep the fire burning until this passes." There were nods of approval. Silas's reputation, already solid, had grown considerably in the weeks since he had publicly acknowledged the superiority of Elspeth's thermal design. He was no longer just the best builder in the valley. He was the builder who had the humility to learn. And in a frontier community where pride could kill you, humility was a virtue worth respecting. The meeting adjourned. People scattered to their preparations. Silas found Elspeth as she was leaving. "Mrs. Morgan," he said. "If the storm is as bad as the glass suggests, I want you to consider coming to town. Your cellar is sound, but if something goes wrong, you are 3 miles from help. I appreciate the concern, Mr. Thorne, but the cellar is designed for this. The earth does not care about storms. The earth does not. But you might. I will be fine." He looked like he wanted to argue, but he had learned over the past weeks that arguing with Elspeth Morgan was an exercise in futility. Instead, he simply nodded. "If you change your mind, the depot will be there." She walked back to the cellar through the strange, silent afternoon, the air growing colder by the hour, the sky taking on a peculiar yellow-gray tinge that made the snow look dirty and the shadows look wrong. By the time she reached home, the first flakes were beginning to fall. Not the light dancing flakes of a normal snowfall, but heavy wet flakes that fell straight down like they were being poured from a bucket. She spent the evening reinforcing her wood supply, stacking it inside the cellar entrance where it would stay dry and accessible. She checked the vents, cleared ice from the chimney stack, sealed a small crack in the doorframe that she had been meaning to fix for weeks. By nightfall, the snow was falling heavily, and the wind was beginning to rise. She ate a simple dinner of beans and salt pork heated on the stove, and sat reading Owen's journal by candlelight. The entry for January 12th, 1884, exactly 4 years ago, caught her eye. The worst storms are not the coldest. They are the ones that arrive when you are not expecting them. When your guard is down, when you have convinced yourself that the hard part is over. Nature does not fight fair. It waits for complacency, then it strikes. The only defense is constant vigilance and deep reserves, not just of food and fuel, but of will. She closed the journal and lay down to sleep, listening to the wind beginning to howl outside, a sound like distant wolves, hungry and patient and utterly indifferent to human plans. She woke on the morning of January 12th to a world transformed. The wind was no longer howling. It was screaming a constant, high-pitched shriek that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound so pervasive that it stopped being sound and became a physical presence, a pressure against the ears and the skull. The cellar door rattled in its frame. Snow was being driven through gaps she had not known existed, creating small drifts on the floor near the entrance. She lit a candle and checked the thermometer. 61 degrees. The temperature outside, she knew without checking, had plummeted. This was not a normal storm. This was something else entirely. She forced the door open against the wind, and the world outside was gone. Not hidden. Gone. There was no visibility at all. Just a wall of white moving horizontally with such violence that it seemed solid, like a physical barrier that could not be crossed. The temperature hit her like a fist. She could feel her exposed skin beginning to burn with cold in seconds. She pulled the door shut and leaned against it, her heart pounding. This was the killer. This was the storm the old-timers had warned about. The kind that came maybe once in a generation, that people remembered and named, that became a marker in time. Before the blizzard. After the blizzard. In Redemption, 3 miles away, the town was under siege. The storm had arrived with shocking speed. At 2 in the afternoon, the temperature had been a relatively mild 30 degrees. Children had been in school. Farmers had been doing chores. Life had been proceeding with its normal winter rhythm. Then, in the space of 30 minutes, the sky had dropped like a curtain. The wind had risen to a scream, and the temperature had fallen 50 degrees. 50 degrees. In half an hour, the children trying to walk home from school were lost in the whiteout before they had gone 100 yards. Some were found by parents who had rushed out to meet them, both parties nearly freezing in the process. Others wandered in circles, disoriented, crying invisible to rescuers who were sometimes within arm's reach, but could not see them through the blinding snow. It was only by luck and the quick thinking of the schoolteacher who tied a rope to the schoolhouse door and sent children along it in groups that most made it to safety, but not all. In his showcase cabin, Silas Thorne was fighting a losing battle against physics. He had a fire roaring in his massive stone fireplace logs, the size of a man's torso, burning with such intensity that the flames licked up into the chimney throat seeking escape. The cabin should have been an oven. Instead, it was freezing. The problem was simple and catastrophic. The fireplace, with its enormous updraft, was pulling air into the cabin at a furious rate. And that air had to come from somewhere. It was coming through every crack, every gap in the chinking, every imperfect seal around the windows and door frames. And that air was 40 degrees below zero. The cabin had become a machine for converting wood into waste heat that shot straight up the chimney and into the sky, while simultaneously pumping frigid air directly into the living space. 10 feet from the fire, Judith and the children huddled under blankets, their breath visible, their faces pale. 20 feet from the fire, a cup of water left on the table had frozen solid. Silas fed log after log into the inferno, his face a mask of growing desperation. He had built this cabin to be the finest in the territory. He had used the best materials, the tightest joinery, the most advanced techniques he knew. And it was failing. Not because it was poorly built, but because the fundamental design was flawed. It was fighting the cold instead of working with it. And in this fight, the cold was winning. By nightfall, his wood supply, which should have lasted a week, was half gone. By midnight, the temperature inside had dropped to 45 degrees despite the fire. The children were coughing. Judith was wrapped in every blanket they owned, and Silas, standing close enough to the fire to feel his face burning, felt his back and shoulders shaking with cold. He thought about the widow in her hole in the ground, and for the first time he did not think of her as someone to be saved. He thought of her as someone who might have the answer. Morning came, though it was hard to tell in the endless white chaos. The storm had not abated. If anything, it had intensified. The wind was a physical force, shaking buildings, tearing shingles from roofs, driving snow through gaps that should have been impenetrable. The temperature remained locked at 40 below, and the wind chill pushed it far lower into territory where exposed skin froze in seconds, where breathing hurt, where life itself became a calculated risk. In the depot cabin, which had been opened as emergency shelter, 43 people were crowded together, sharing body heat, sharing fear. Silas's fire, fed constantly by volunteers working in shifts, was burning through wood at an unsustainable rate. The interior temperature, despite the crowd in the inferno, was holding at 38 degrees. People were cold, frightened, but alive. For now. But the wood supply was dwindling faster than anyone had anticipated. By Silas's calculation, they had perhaps 24 hours of fuel remaining. After that, the fire would go out, and the temperature in the cabin would equalize with the outside in a matter of hours. And at 40 below, that meant death. He stood by the fire, watching the flames consume another log, and made a decision that he knew would haunt him for the rest of his life, one way or another. He turned to Judith, who was sitting with Clara and Nathaniel wrapped in blankets, her face drawn and exhausted. "I am going to the Morgan cellar," he said quietly. Judith looked up sharply. "Silas, you will die out there. The visibility is 0. The temperature will kill you in minutes. If I stay here, we all die when the wood runs out." Her cellar was at 63 degrees last week. Her system does not depend on burning wood faster than we can cut it. If she is still alive, if her system is still working, it is our only chance. And if you freeze before you get there, then I freeze, but at least I tried. He did not wait for her to argue further. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned, wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs, making his eyes water instantly. The tears froze on his cheeks. The world was a white void, screaming infinite, disorienting. He could not see the depot cabin behind him. He could not see anything. He tied a rope around his waist, anchored it to the cabin door, and began to walk. The cellar was perhaps 200 yards from the depot. In normal conditions, a 3-minute walk. In this, it might as well have been on the moon. He walked with one hand extended, feeling for trees, for landmarks, for anything solid in the chaos. The rope played out behind him. 50 feet. 100. He had no idea if he was going in the right direction. The wind was disorienting, pushing him sideways, turning him around. His face was numb. His fingers, even inside heavy gloves, were starting to lose sensation. His lungs burned with every breath. 150 feet. The rope was running out. If he did not find the cellar before it ended, he would have to make a choice. Go back or cut the rope and continue blind. One meant admitting failure. The other meant probable death. He felt something solid. A tree. No, not a tree. A bush. Hawthorn from the feel of the thorns even through his gloves. He knew these bushes. They marked the entrance to the cellar. He dropped to his knees, feeling through the snow, and found the door. He pounded on it, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. He pounded again, harder, and this time he felt it give slightly. The door opened. Warm air rushed out, so warm it felt like summer, like a miracle. Elspeth Morgan stood there, a candle in her hand, her face shocked. Mr. Thorne. He fell through the entrance into warmth, into air that did not hurt to breathe, and lay on the earthen floor, gasping, his body shaking uncontrollably. Elspeth shut the door against the storm and knelt beside him, pulling off his ice-crusted scarf, his frozen gloves, "Are you alone?" she asked. He managed to shake his head, trying to form words through numb lips. "Depot, 40 people, wood running out. We need—" He could not finish. The enormity of what he was asking, what he had come to do, overwhelmed him. He, Silas Thorne, master builder, the man who had mocked her system, who had warned her she would die, was here to beg for shelter in the very hole he had called a tomb. Elspeth understood immediately. She helped him sit up, wrapped a blanket around him, and spoke with a calm that cut through his panic. "How long before the wood is gone?" 20 hours, maybe less. "Can they walk here in this storm?" "I do not know. I barely made it. But if they stay, they freeze." Elspeth was quiet for a moment, thinking, calculating. Then she moved to the corner where her supplies were stored and began pulling out everything she could spare. Blankets, food, candles. "My system can handle the cold," she said, "but it cannot handle 43 people. The space is too small. The air would not circulate properly. But it can handle 10, maybe 12 if we are careful. Then we choose who lives." Silas's voice was hollow. "No, we make them all walk. The depot is 200 yards. If we create a rope line, if we move people in groups of 5, if we work fast, we can get everyone here before hypothermia sets in. It will be the hardest thing they have ever done, but it is possible. You would do this. After everything I said. After I called you mad." Elspeth looked at him with eyes that held no anger, no triumph, only a deep, weary compassion. "Mr. Thorne, your family is cold. Every family in that depot is cold. This is not about being right or wrong. This is about survival. Now stand up. We have work to do." They made 3 trips between the cellar and the depot, fighting through the white chaos, bringing groups of 5 at a time along the rope line. Children came first, crying, terrified, but moving because their parents told them to move. Then the elderly, then the adults. Each journey was a battle, a test of will against a storm that seemed determined to erase human presence from the landscape entirely. It took 4 hours to move everyone. 4 hours of fighting through wind that felt like it was trying to strip the skin from their bones, through cold that turned fingers to wood and thoughts to molasses. Several people collapsed and had to be dragged. One elderly man, Thomas Waverley's father, did not make it, his heart giving out halfway through the journey, the cold and the strain too much. They left his body in the snow, marked with a stick, and continued. There was no time for grief. Grief was a luxury for after survival. By evening, 42 people were packed into a cellar designed for one. They filled every available space, sitting shoulder to shoulder, children on laps, bodies pressed together for warmth. The air was thick, heavy with breath and the smell of fear. But it was warm. Elspeth moved through the crowd, adjusting vents, opening the secondary air intake, fully damping the stove down to barely glowing embers. The system had not been designed for this load, but it was adapting. The body heat from 42 people was significant, and the earth walls, charged with weeks of stored thermal energy, were radiating it back steadily. The thermometer, which had read 63 degrees that morning, now read 57. Cool, but survivable, far warmer than the depot cabin, which was already dropping toward freezing as its fire burned down to ash. Silas sat against the wall, Clara on one side, Nathaniel on the other, Judith beside him. He stared at the earthen walls, at the simple pot-belly stove with its pipe disappearing into the floor, at the widow who had built this system that was now keeping his entire family alive. How? He said the word coming out as a whisper. Elspeth, passing nearby, heard him and stopped. How what, Mr. Thorne? How is this possible? This hole in the ground is warmer than the finest cabin in the territory. How? Because the cabin is a sieve for heat, she said gently. Beautiful, well-built, but fundamentally designed to lose energy. This cellar is a battery. It stores energy. It does not fight the cold. It absorbs it, holds it, and gives back warmth in return. Your cabin burns. This place remembers. Silas closed his eyes, and something inside him, some structure of pride and certainty that had defined him for 20 years, collapsed like a building with its foundation removed. I was so sure I was right, he said. So certain that the old ways were superstition, that American methods were superior. I almost let my family freeze because I could not imagine that I might be wrong. You are here now, Elspeth said. That took courage. It took desperation. Often the same thing. The storm raged for 2 more days. Outside, the world was erased, turned into a white void, where time lost meaning and direction was impossible. Inside the cellar, 42 people learned to live in a space meant for one to share resources, to ration food and water, to be patient with cramped muscles and short tempers. Clara Thorne sat beside Elspeth for hours reading passages from Owen's journal to anyone who would listen. The adults, at first dismissive, began to pay attention. The technical notes, the careful observations about thermal mass and airflow and the long memory of stone became a kind of scripture, a text that explained the miracle of their survival. On the 3rd day, the wind began to fade. The temperature rose slightly. The white void outside became translucent, then gray, then finally began to reveal shapes. Trees, hills, a world that had been hidden. When the storm finally broke, when the sky cleared to a hard, brilliant blue, they emerged from the cellar like survivors of a shipwreck, staggering onto shore. The world was transformed. Snow drifts 20 feet high. Trees snapped in half. The depot cabin buried to its roofline. They dug out Thomas Waverley's father and buried him properly. They counted the cost. 11 people dead across the county. Most of them isolated farmers who had been caught unprepared. The town of redemption. 42 strong had lost only one, and he had died from a heart that was already weak. It could have been so much worse. Mayor Merrick, standing in the snow outside the cellar, addressed the crowd that had gathered. The wager, he said, is concluded. I declare Mrs. Elspeth Morgan the winner by every measure. Her system is superior in efficiency, in resilience, and in fundamental wisdom. The railroad will be petitioned for 5 times standard compensation, and a public apology will be issued to the Welsh mining community for the dismissal of foreign engineering methods. There was applause, but it was muted, respectful. This was not a sporting event. This was a recognition of truth learned the hard way. Silas Thorne stepped forward. "I would like to make a proposal," he said, his voice carrying across the snow. "I am a builder. Mrs. Morgan is an engineer. Separately, we make fine structures. Together, I believe we could make something better. I propose the formation of Morgan Thorne Thermal Engineering. Joint partnership, equal shares. Her design knowledge and my construction skills. We build homes that do not just shelter, but that work with the land. Homes that remember summer through winter, as her husband once wrote." Elspeth, standing beside him, felt the weight of the moment. This was not just a business proposal. This was the vindication of everything Owen had believed, everything he had written in his journal, but never lived to see realized. "I accept Mr. Thorne," she said, "on one condition. Every design bears my husband's name. Owen Reese Morgan Thermal Systems. His legacy lives on." Agreed. They shook hands in the snow, and the crowd cheered this time, with real warmth, real hope. Not just for warmth in winter, but for the possibility that the hard land they had chosen to live on might, with the right knowledge, become a partner instead of an adversary. Augustus Blackwell, the railroad agent, arrived 3 days later with a revised offer. 5 times compensation as per the wager. $850, enough to build a real house, to establish a business, to start fresh. And a contract for consulting services providing thermal design for all future railroad structures in the territory. But more than that, he brought an apology written on railroad letterhead and signed by the territorial manager. "We regret the dismissal of Welsh engineering methods and acknowledge the superior thermal design demonstrated by Mrs. Elspeth Morgan. The Northern Pacific Railroad recognizes the value of traditional knowledge and commits to incorporating such methods in future construction." It was, Elspeth knew, mostly words, but words mattered. They created space for different ideas, different approaches. They opened doors. The years that followed were years of building. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as word spread. The Morgan Thorne method, as it came to be known, revolutionized frontier architecture across Dakota Territory and beyond. Not every home was built underground, but every home incorporated the principles. Thermal mass, heat recovery, working with the earth instead of against it, patience over brute force. Silas proved to be an extraordinary partner. He had the humility to learn and the skills to execute. Together, they designed structures that were beautiful and efficient, that kept families warm through brutal winters while using a fraction of the wood that conventional homes required. Griff Llewellyn lived to see the first 20 homes built using the Welsh method. He died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1892, at the age of 76, in a home that stayed warm on 4 logs a day. Judith Thorne published a textbook, Frontier Physics: The Morgan Method, which became required reading at the Colorado School of Mines and was translated into 6 languages. And Clara Thorne, the girl who had sat in a cellar reading her friend's dead husband's journal, to frighten people, became the 3rd woman ever admitted to the Colorado School of Mines. She graduated top of her class in 1898 and returned to Dakota as a full professional engineer, ready to carry the work forward into a new century. 10 years after the blizzard on a spring day when the hills were green and the air was soft, Elspeth Morgan stood in front of what had once been a simple root cellar and was now the Morgan Technical Institute. The original cellar had been expanded, reinforced, turned into a classroom and workshop where apprentices learned the old ways and the new science that explained them. 12 students sat on benches carved from the same trees that had witnessed her first desperate winter. 6 men, 6 women ranging in age from 16 to 40. They were learning to read the land, to understand thermal dynamics, to build structures that breathed. Elspeth, now 42. Her hair showing threads of silver, stood at the front with Owen's journal preserved now in a glass case, open to a page that had become the school's unofficial motto. "My husband wrote," she said, her voice strong and clear, "that the mountain does not fight winter." What did he mean? Clara Thorne, now 18 and wearing the brass pin of a certified mining engineer, stood to answer. "The mountain stores summer," she said. "It holds heat in its stone through the cold months and releases it slowly. It does not waste energy fighting what it cannot change. It adapts, it remembers, it waits." And what do we do? The class answered in unison, words they had learned by heart. "We listen to mountains." Elspeth smiled, feeling the presence of everyone who had brought her to this moment. Owen, whose vision had started it all. Griff, who had believed when belief was costly. Silas, who had learned humility. Judith, who had trusted evidence over assumption. Clara, who had carried the knowledge forward into a new generation. She closed the journal and looked at her students at the future. "Go build," she said. "Build homes that breathe. Build partnerships that last. Build with the earth, not against it. And always, always remember that the most powerful solutions are not found by fighting nature, but by understanding its systems." They filed out into the spring sunshine, ready to transform a hard land into a home, one breathing house at a time. Elspeth stood alone in the classroom for a moment, then walked to the glass case and placed her hand on it, feeling the worn leather cover beneath the glass. "We did it, Owen," she whispered. "The smoke paid its rent. The earth remembered. They listened." Outside, the hills were green and alive, and in the distance she could see the smoke rising from 47 Morgan Thorne homes, thin wisps that spoke of efficiency of knowledge applied, of warmth without waste. The legacy was not written in stone or recorded in official histories. It was written in the comfort of families who stayed warm through brutal winters, in the knowledge passed from teacher to student, in the understanding that the earth treated as a partner would provide exactly what was needed, if only you knew how to ask. Elspeth walked out into the afternoon light, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, and knew that she had kept her promise. To Owen, to herself, to everyone who had believed that there was a better way. The earth's memory was long, and now so was theirs.